Abel paced towards the towering monstrosity, casually nonchalant in his motion, swaggering and grinning as he did so. A massive two-handed claymore was held in place over one of his shoulders, the wiring gears and saws that covered its surface trundling noisily, while the many blades that made up its jagged edge slowly slid across the rim contently, purring like a cat. The beast in front of him was a mammoth of sparse landscape, a monument of destruction, the waves of hatred and anger radiating off of its frame, palpable, rivaling even Abel's lust for blood. It simply stood there, a mass of heavily plated carcass and flesh, small black eyes in its mammoth skull like holes into a void, resting malevolently above the thick, serrated fangs, slick with drool. Even as he approached it, it was steadily changing its tissue, warping the plates and armor, growing thicker, mounds of muscle and sinew and bone sliding over each other. Instantly, all of the bid to reform into something that would better withstand the coming assaults. Truly, this was a godhead of annihilation, a being that would embody the primal destruction of existence. He could hardly contain his glee after all this time. After the weight of centuries, he would actually meet a being that could surpass his capacity for violence. Maybe. He walked until he was mere feet from the colossal form, and after a moment to savor this wondrous anticipation that he was feeling, he spoke up. I've heard tales of creatures like you, glorious beast of scale and flesh, talons and fangs and prowess in battle, even greater than the immense intellect hiding behind those bestial eyes. They said your kind once ruled the earth from enormous stockpiles of treasure, killing and eating all who displeased you. But you were knocked from your throne, one by the great warriors who walked this world, no longer, until there was no more, and you became but a mere myth. He whispered breathlessly. Even I had thought that you were nothing but fairy tales, but yet, here you stand before me, a living dragon. There was a rumble from the beast, and its mouth began to move, cracking open slowly as a statue coming to life. Pathetic. It grumbled, its voice thick and heavy like a mountain collapsing into itself 1,000 times over. A dragon, you simple little pile of rot. You do not understand anything, as I would expect as a well-trained lapdog. At this, Abel's expression darkened, and the sound of the swords on his shoulder began to pick up as the blades twirled ever so fast. What? He said slowly in a low voice that spoke of rage, barely contained. That is what you are, is it not? A trained and broken mutt, bound with the collar and all. It murmured, gesturing slightly towards the thick metal choker around his shoulder and neck. I chose this, he replied stiffly, his face contorted into a scowl. Whether you chose this or not, you are still a dog to those things. The only difference is that you eat from their hand rather than a whole. It sneered, the expression almost visible in its inhuman face. Abel's face twitched. He tightened his grip on his handle of his sword, the revolving blades now turning at considerable speed, protesting with a dull screech. At least I can choose my fate! He roared angrily, launching his sword into a downward swing at the beast's head like an almighty wrath of some obscene god. But the creature responded in a way Abel had never before seen in all his millennia of fighting. It headbutted the weapon, the top of its skull, shell and all shattered into a bulky fragment, its eyes bulging as the inside of its cranium was pulverized. One of its eyes bursted with a wet pop, the torrent of thick, viscous fluid gushed from its mouth, chunks of meat and tissue pouring forth like a fountain of blood and gore. But in the headbutting of the blade, Abel was thrown off balance by its force, recoiling from the attack automatically, leaving his stomach wide open. In that split second, defenselessness, his sight was filled with a ginormous fist of monster, a boulder-sized bulk of bony plate, plummeting into his entire torso, smashing into him with the force of a hurricane and knocking his sword from his hands. He was flung over 10 meters away like a rag doll, demolishing innumerable obstacles in his way. His body skid heavily against the ground, shredding the clothes and skin from his back until he finally came to an abrupt stop, half embedded into a large boulder. He hung there limply, streams of blood pouring from his eyes, nose, and mouth and ears, his face slack and stunned in expression of amazement. And then he laughed. He laughed long and hard, smiling and baring his pointed teeth in a bloody smirk that made it appear that he had just finished a gruesome meal. He spoke up in a language long since dead, but the meaning of the words were unmistakable. He was issuing a challenge. But to his surprise, the lizard looked at it and was having some kind of seizure. It was repeatedly sucking in air and heavily breathing it through its nostrils, puffing itself up even bigger than it normally was, and consuming the viscous soaked dirt quickly, its huge claws scrabbling away at the ground, stuffing clumps into its toothy maw. And then something amazing happened. The wound which had warped the creature's skull into a misshapen tomato began to undo itself. The beast head shifting back into its regular shape, the broken plate buckling and falling off to be consumed once more and revealing a shiny, wet carpus form under the old, even thicker than the last. Fate. What would you understand of fate? Fate and you are all this is death. The creature bellowed, beginning to charge towards it. At this, Abel chuckled. Well, I can't argue with that, he replied gleefully, pulling an enormous mace out of the shadows of his ragged clothes. It handled well over 6 feet in length. Its head, nothing more than a mass of wiring spikes screaming obscenely as they spun in an intricate pattern of death. The beast lumbered towards him quickly, its mighty footstep causing the earth to shake. Clods of dirt torn in its wake, bearing down on him with the force of an inevitable avalanche. Abel pulling back, standing sideways, moving his arms back behind him, and grinding his feet into the ground, he turned towards the embedding disaster, swinging his weapon idly with a seasoned flare. And then the beast was upon him, and he swung, time seeming to stop. His weapon once more collided with the creature's head. There was a defeating crunch as its head was crushed again. Splattering into pieces, the spine impacting the monster became visibly shorter than the unstoppable force propelling it met with the immovable force colliding with it. The sheer amount of chaos generated by these two immense forces meeting launched the reptile several dozen meters away, spinning it like an errant missile. Lumps of it flying off, it sailed through the air, it hit the earth with a boom. Bits and pieces of its frame dotting the landscape around the impacted crater like a raindrops during spring shower. Abel cracked his neck, ignoring the blood streaming down his thick gashes down his leg, where the 3 along his chest gained when the opponent slashed at him as he swung. Instead, he discarded the now bent and bloody body that he now has. Him with an uncaring toss, popped his shoulder back into place with a jerky, awkward shrug, and started to rest his shattered elbow. The creature pushed itself up, eating everything around it, growing heavier, thicker, and more rock-like in appearance. It shook off the excess blood from its form like a dog, droplets of thick, dark liquid spattering the earth around it, and began to clump out of the crater. It lumbered over the lip of its fissure it had created, only the greeted with a large chakram shredding into its flesh. The ring digging it into the exterior saw blade spun and forced its way even deeper into the wound. Several more followed suit, flying from Abel's hands as he drew them out of the shadows. Running towards his opponent, he threw himself into the air, unleashing a monstrous axe from his folds his cloak. The hammering down onto his opponent like a bomb, it shrugged off the attack as a horse does a gnat. Trying to swat Abel with its huge claw hands, he dodged and weaved around it, sailing fist planting drill like daggers into its thick hide, leaving them to rip and tear into its flesh. Whenever attack would come close to landing on him, he would pull himself aside using the embedded knives close at hand. Still, the creature showed no signs of slowing its attack, or even that it felt any pain at all. It was a single-minded a mind-assaulted monster, with only one objective in sight: to kill. Suddenly, a stray claw caught Abel across the shoulder, causing him to stumble. He was rewarded with this action with another crossing fist into the gut, pinning him solidly to the ground. The beast lifted its other claws to do the finishing blow. The executioner's axe raised for its unsightly purpose, and then descending into the flesh of the light and the shadow, it raised its hand again to crush whatever remained of Abel, but was mildly surprised to find that its arm suddenly ended at the elbow, a river of molten blood flowing freely from the wound. The other arm quickly followed suit, snapping off in the joints by the gigantic mechanical pair of scissors held by Abel, the inner blade sliding freshly from the gore spraying from their moving teeth. The monster attempted to consume the fallen limbs and replace what he had lost, only to meet with the bladed boot of Abel, kicking it directly in the bottom of the jaw and knocking into its back. Abel fell onto the prone creature like a jackal onto its prey, laying into the creature with an animalistic ferocity. Screaming incoherently in berserk blood rage, he kept pounding into the beast with its weapons, pulling out fresh ones time after another to get deeper, lunging deeper and pulling out or broken from the sheer strain. Eventually he pulled back, his breath heavy, drenched completely in vile-smelling crimson blood, a hellish appreciation. He watched it still struggle to breathe, its body still trying to reform itself. And that's when he saw it. A pulse emitted from the creature, a shockwave that forced aside the heavy fabric of reality, the world warping around the beast as its shock of electricity quickly ran across the mutilated body. But however, he did not care. He expected no quarter, and he would give none. It looked at him weakly, blatant disgust and hatred still strong, still as clear as it had even always been. He pulled a last long sword out of his shredded cloak and intended to deliver the final blow. The beast bared its fangs and shot out his sword descendant. His blades buried itself into the roof of the creature's mouth, traveling straight through its brain and out the top of its head, the blades still spinning, and they ripped through the pulsing gray matter. Still the monster lived, and toothy maw wrapped around Abel's arm, its eyes suddenly smugly and gently, almost reverently, but directly through his arm's ivory teeth, effortlessly slicing through the muscle and the bone, meeting together with a light click. Abel staggered it back in surprise, and the creature reared back, headbutting him in the skull with a piercing crack, knocking him onto his butt. It gave him a final cold look and opened his mouth to consume him. Before its jaw closed around him, Abel grabbed the sword still embedded into its head, grasping the hilt with inside of his mouth. As the beast's mouth closed around him, he forced it down with all of his strength, slicing the beast down in two. But its motion, once set in action, could not be stopped. The teeth cleaved his upper torso in two, freeing his remaining arm, head, and flopless, lifeless body onto the ground. With his final moments of consciousness, Abel thought that he could hear a strange whistling sound like something falling from a great height. Then only darkness. Time passed as a dreamless sleep, and Abel awoke to find himself a whole anew back in his tomb. He moved jerkily, forcing open the coffin that held him, pushing aside the chains, hurtled in a bid to get out the bitter cold. It took him several minutes to unlock the stone door that blocked his escape, all the time pawing at the frosty ground with his boots. His breath crystallized in front of him. When he finally did emerge, his breath of a sigh in relief. He had never liked the cold, being more of a man of heat and warmth. He reasoned to himself that was most likely the best fight he had ever had in ages. There should be a feast to celebrate with all of his team. Now, where had they put that strange pizza box?